Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Sameches Amud Beis, 68b of Maseches Kiddushin, and we are on the second line of the page. And the Gemara is trying to source the idea that if a man marries a woman, or marries, because we're talking about a case where Kiddushin doesn't take effect, but if a man has a child with a woman with whom Kiddushin wouldn't take effect with anybody because she's either a shivcha, she's a Canaanite maidservant, or she's not Jewish, in which case there's no Kiddushin, so the child is not a mamzer. So the Gemara is going to ask how we know Kiddushin doesn't take effect, and how we know that the child would not be a mamzer, or that the child follows the mother. So that's where we pick up. Last week we asked about the Canaanite maidservant, and now the Gemara asks, middle of the second line, Nachris minalan. How do we know that Kiddushin does not take effect if a Jewish man tries to give Kiddushin to a non-Jewish woman? Says the Gemara Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Lo sischatein bam. You may not marry them. And the Gemara here is understanding not just that you may not marry them, but you cannot. It won't work. It won't work to marry them. So there we have that Kiddushin does not take effect with a non-Jewish woman. Says the Gemara, Ashkachna de lo tafsi ba Kiddushi. So we have a verse that Kiddushin doesn't take effect. But Vulada kamo samina. Like, how do we know that if they do have a relationship and they have a child, that the child follows the status of the mother and is also not Jewish? Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum, Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan says the name of Reb Shimon bar Yochai, de Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Ki yasir es bincha me'acharai. Because he will cause your son to go astray from before me. And the context of this pasuk is that before this it said, Bitcha lo sitem livno. You should not give your daughter to his son, meaning to someone from the Canaanite nation, as a wife for his son. Uvito lo sikacha bincha, and it says, and his daughter, the Canaanite's daughter, you shouldn't take as a wife for your son. So basically, don't marry your son to his daughter. Don't marry his daughter to your son. And then it says, why? Ki yasir es bincha. Because he will cause your son to stray. Now, it doesn't say because he will cause your daughter to stray. So, it's not talking about the intermarriage that's going on. Because if it was, it would have said, don't marry your son to his daughter, don't marry your daughter to his son, which it does. But then it would say because it will cause the son to go astray, it will cause the daughter to go astray. But it doesn't. What it only mentions is because it will cause your son to go astray. So which son is this? So it's talking about, in the case where you marry, it's saying don't marry your daughter to his son, to Canaanite son, because it will cause your son, meaning your grandson, to go astray. So that's what the Gemara says now. It quotes the pasuk, Ki yasir es bincha me'acharei, because it will cause your son to go astray. Bincha haba mi-Yisrael es kari bincha. The idea is that your son, meaning your grandson that comes from a Jew, would be called your son. Vein bincha haba min ha'ovedes kochavim kari bincha. But your son that comes from a non-Jewish woman, would not be considered your son, ala binah. Rather, it is her son. So when the Torah here says, because it will cause your son to go astray, it sounds like it's talking about the case where you married your daughter to a non-Jew, and they have a son, they have a child. It will cause your son to go astray, and that teaches me that your daughter's son is still called bincha. It's your son. It's your grandson. He's considered Jewish, but it doesn't say. But if the son, it says ki yasir. Sorry, one more important point. It says ki yasir es bincha. He will cause your son to go astray. it doesn't say ki sasir as bincha, she will cause your son to go astray. So it sounds like it's only talking about, we know we're talking about a grandson, because we know we're not talking about that first generation, because, meaning the concern of causing to go astray, because it doesn't mention the daughter, right? Just to recap. It says, don't marry your son to his daughter, don't marry your daughter to his son. And then it says, why? Because he will cause your son to go astray. Now, if it was talking about that son who you married to the Canaanite daughter, then it should also say, it will cause your son to go astray, it will cause your daughter to go astray, the daughter that you married to the Canaanite, the Canaanite man. So it's not talking about the child that you marry off, it's talking about the grandchild, the product of that marriage. And it says that he will cause your son to go astray, which means it's talking about the case where your daughter marries a Canaanite man. He will cause your son to go astray, and it's your son because it's your grandson. But since it's from a Jewish mother, so then it's a Jewish child. But it doesn't say that she will cause your son to go astray. Meaning, in the case where you marry your son off to a Canaanite woman, and they have a son, it's not your son. That's why it doesn't say that it's not your grandson, meaning it's not a Jewish grandchild. And we're not concerned about the child going astray there, because the child is not a Jewish child. The child is a Canaanite child. That's where that's where the daughter is the mother is a Canaanite and the father is a Jew. So what we see is that we see that the Vlada Kamosa, we see the child follows the lineage of the mother. If the mother's not Jewish, the child's not Jewish. Okay, so Amar Ravina, says Ravina, Shma Mina, we can learn from here, Ben Bitcha Haba Mina Ovid Kochavim, the son of your daughter from a non-Jewish father. So if the daughter marries or has a child with a non-Jew, Karabincha is still called your son. It's your grandson, but it's a Jewish child. So Ravina says it's called Bincha, it's called your son. Now says the Gemara, Neima Kasav Ravina, Obed Kechavim ve'Ebed Haba Bas Yisrael Pan Mamzer. So if it's a Jewish son, so maybe we should go a step further and say the child is a mamzer. We have a illicit relationship here of a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish man. The child is Jewish, as we've said, so maybe that child should be a mamzer, as being that he's the product of an illicit relationship. Says the Gemara, no, nehida kasher lohave, even though he's not a kasher, it's considered a tainted offspring, but mamzer lohave. He's not a mamzer either. Psul mikri. He's called a apostle. He's not a mamzer. He's the product of an illicit relationship, but he is not a mamzer. Fine. And Rashi quotes from the Gemara in Yevamos where that's learned from, and basically the idea is similar to what we had in our Mishnah, but there it derives this idea: if the father is not shayach to Kiddushin, if there's no relevance of Kiddushin to the father, which is the case that the father's not Jewish, then the child's not a mamzer. That's what the Gemara learns out over there. So if the child's not Jewish, if the father's not Jewish, the child will not be a mamzer. There's something puzzle about the child, being that the father's not Jewish, but practically he's treated like a regular Jew. Okay. Ask the Gemara, Barahu v'shiva gayim ksiv. These verses that we're quoting are specifically speaking about the 7 Canaanite nations. So going all the way back to our first point, how do we know that Kiddushin doesn't take effect for a non-Jewish woman? A Jewish man gives Kiddushin to a non-Jewish woman. How do we know it doesn't take effect? Because it says, Lo sischatim bam, don't marry them, and we said don't marry them means you can't marry them, it won't work. Kiddushin won't take effect. But ask the Gemara, that pasuk is not talking about all non-Jews. It's talking about the 7 Canaanite nations. That's where we have an explicit verse about it. So shar umos minalan. How do we know that for other nations, for other non-Jews, Kiddushin will not take effect? Says the Gemara, Amar Kra ki yasir es bincha. Because the pasuk says, because he will cause your son to go astray. L'rabos kol hamasirim. And that comes to include all those who can cause the child to go astray. So there's a couple ways that you could explain this line. One is that we have the reason. The reason is presented here. The reason why it says not to marry your children, why you can't marry your child to a non-Jew is because it will cause your grandchildren to go astray. So that, even though the verse was about the 7 Canaanite nations, that will be true for any nation. So for any non-Jew. So therefore, that's how we know it's l'rabos kol hamasirim. It includes other nations as well. Alternatively, it could be that there's something extra about this. L'rabos, comes to include, implies that there's something extra, and perhaps because I could have understood the reasoning on my own. I don't need the Torah to tell me the reason, and really the reasoning is kind of superfluous. It doesn't really matter the reason. Why does it give me the reason? So it gives me the reason to include other cases, and it comes to include all. Meaning, so it's not just that the logic applies, but it's the reasoning itself is superfluous. There's something extra coming to include other cases, and those other cases would be any other case where the logic applies. But it's because it's extra that we can extend it to other cases. So the Gemara says, "Hanichon l'Reb Shimon de darish taima dekra." So that's good if you learn like Reb Shimon, who darshins taima dekra. That means that Rabbi Shimon interprets the reason behind a verse, and then applies it, and limits the case and expands the case based on a reason in a verse. But according to the Rabbanan who don't do that, my taima, what would be the reason? Meaning, again, depending on how we explain the previous line exactly, but it seems that one way to explain it would be, according to Reb Shimon, it's extra, because I could figure out the reason on my own. The reason's obvious. And according to Reb Shimon, even where it doesn't state a reason, he's dorish taima dekra. He tries to figure out the reason and apply it, even where it's not stated. So then it doesn't need to be stated. So if it's stated, it's extra. And it's coming to include additional cases. However, according to the Rabbanan, it's only where the reasoning is stated that I can apply a reasoning. If it's not stated, I can't just assume that's the reasoning and apply it. And therefore, it's not extra to state the reasoning. If it's not extra, then I can't apply it it's not coming to include new cases. And so according to the Rabbanan, this should be limited to where it says it. It should be limited to the 7 nations. So how do they know that this that Kiddushin won't take effect even for other non-Jewish women? So Amar Kra, the pasuk says, and this is talking about the situation of a Yefas Toar. So there's in the beginning of Parshas Kiseitze, it talks about when you go out to battle and you take a female captive. So there's a process that one goes through before one is allowed to marry her, and it says there, and after that he can come to her and have relations with her, after he goes through the process. Now, the implication is, first of all, that tavo eleha implies Kiddushin. He can give her Kiddushin at that point, but it's only after he goes through the process described over there. And the implication is that up till then, before he goes through that process, Kiddushin will not take effect. And why not? Because she's a non-Jewish woman, and Kiddushin doesn't take effect on a non-Jewish woman. So we learn from there that in general, Kiddushin doesn't take effect for non-Jews. Okay, says the Gemara, Ashkechan de lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. So we have a source that Kiddushin doesn't take effect by non-Jews even outside of the 7 Canaanite nations. But Vulada kamosa minalim, how do we know that the child follows the mother? we sourced it before for the 7 Canaanite nations, but how do we know that it's true even for other non-Jewish women that the child would follow the mother and not be Jewish, even though if the father is Jewish? So Amar Kra ki siyena le'ish v'yoldu lo. So the pasuk says, this is a pasuk we talked about last week. It's the verse that talks about the man who has 2 wives and he loves one, hates the other. But it says there ki siyena le'ish shtei nashim. If he'll be married to 2 women, v'yoldu lo vanim, and they give birth to children to him. So we have ki siyena when he's married, v'yoldu lo, and they bear children for him. And we can understand from there, kol heicha de karinan be ki siyena, karinan be v'yoldu lo. In order to say that they bore children for him, it has to be that they were siyena, that they were married to him. But anywhere where we wouldn't say they were married, where Kiddushin wouldn't take effect, we wouldn't say that they bore the children for him. And so that's how once we know that Kiddushin doesn't take effect for a non-Jewish woman, so then we know that the child we would not view the child as being the father's child. It's the mother's child. The child would follow the mother and not be Jewish, would not follow the status of the father, because only where Kiddushin takes effect do we say Yoldu Lo, that the children are for him, and follow his status. But if there's no Kiddushin, then they would not follow the father, they would follow the mother. Or at least where there could not be Kiddushin. Meaning it's not necessarily where there is Kiddushin, but where there could be Kiddushin, that's where we would follow the father. If there cannot be Kiddushin there, then we would follow the mother. If that's the case, Shivcha Nami, then this could be a source that Kiddushin doesn't take effect for that the child of a Shivcha, also of a Canaanite maidservant, also follows the mother. In last week's Gemara, the last thing we did, it's the top of this page, where it said, how do we know that the child, if a Jewish man has a child with a Canaanite maidservant, the child follows the mother, is not considered Jewish, is actually an Eved, is a slave. So how do we know that? So the Gemara, top of the page, it said, when you have a Hebrew, an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave who marries a Canaanite woman, the Canaanite maidservant, the child, it says, the children belong to the master, meaning they are slaves like their mother, the Canaanite maidservant. That was the source. But according to this, now we don't need that source because any woman for whom there cannot be Kiddushin, the child will follow the mother. So we don't need that source. So the Gemara says, the Gemara says, you're right, we don't need it. So then what is it teaching me? What are the words that, when it says there, that the woman and her children will belong to the master, why do I need that? Look at it, Tanya. I need it for the following teaching. Top of the next page. Ha'omer l'shivchaso hariat bas chorin. If a man has a Canaanite maidservant and she's pregnant, and he says, you are free, uvladich eved, but your child, your baby, should remain a slave, havlad kamosa. The child actually goes free also. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili, those are the words of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rashi inserts, we're talking about where he gave her a get shichr, he gave her a document of release, because that's required to release a slave. So he released her, he gave her the document, but he said the child, is going to remain an Eved. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says it doesn't work, the Vlad follows her. When the child is born, the child is free. And we'll see how he knows that in a moment. The Chachamim say Dvarav Kayamim. The Chachamim say, the other rabbis say Dvarav Kayam. No, his words are upheld. The child is not free. The baby, when it's born, remains a slave. Then the Gemara says Mishum Shenemar, because the pasuk says Ha'ishav Yiladeh Tiyel Adonai. The woman and her children will belong to the master. So now, ask the Gemara, my Talmudah, what is that pasuk teaching me? What do you mean because it says that? What does that have to do with what we just said? So, Amar Rava ad Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rava says it's going back on what Rabbi Yossi Aglili said. Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that if a man says to a woman, a pregnant woman, that a pregnant Canaanite slave, you're free, but your child is a slave. So Rabbi Yossi Glili said, no, the child is also free. And how does he know it? That's what the pasuk is being brought for. It's at the end of the brayso, but it was really going for Rabbi Yossi Glili. Because it says, because it says, the woman and her children will belong to the master. And says Rabbi Yossi Glili that the implication is, as long as the woman is the master's, the child that's born will also belong to the master. But if the woman is not, means if it has to be both. It's a package deal. If the woman belongs to the master, then the child does. But if not, not. That's why Rabbi Yossi Glili says that if the master sets the woman free when she's pregnant, even if he tries to maintain ownership of the fetus of the baby, that does not work. And the Rabbanan say that it does work. Okay, continuing in the next Mishnah, says the Mishnah, Rabbi Tarfon says, Yicholin mamzerin litahir. It is possible for a mamzer to purify himself. Meaning, not that he can really purify himself, but he can purify his offspring. Even though a mamzer is not allowed to marry a Jewish woman, a regular Jewish woman. He has to marry a mamzeres. He has to marry a mamzeres. A mamzeres also has to marry a mamzer. Now, Rabbi Tarfon says it's possible, and this is every generation, by the way. This is continuous. Once from a mamzer family, always from a mamzer family, and they would have to interbreed. That's why it's so problematic to produce. Besides for that, it comes from an illicit relationship, but the product is just it's a very difficult situation for the child to be in. But Rabbi Tarfon says, I have a solution. Yicholin mamzerin l'tayr. It's possible for the offspring of a mamzer to become purified, to be able to marry regular Jews. Ketzad, how do you do it? Mamzer shenasa shifcha. If a mamzer marries a Canaanite maidservant, so then Bina Eved, her son, or Havlad Eved, the child, will be a slave, a non-Jewish slave, and not a mamzer. Shichraro, and if he then frees the slave, Nimtza haben ben chorin, then he's now a free man, convert, and not a mamzer. So the way to kind of shake the mamzer name, says Rabbi Tarfon, is to have the mamzer marry a shifcha, a Canaanite slave. The child will be an eved. You can then free the eved or the shifcha. You can free the child, and then the child is just a free person, a convert, and not a mamzer. Rabbi Eliezer argues, and he says, "Harei ze eved mamzer." No. It's still a mamzer. It's an eved and a mamzer now, which is a very interesting thing. We have sort of this Canaanite slave mamzer, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. Says the Gemara, Yibayilahu. They asked them, Rabbi Tarfon lechatchila kamar o di'eved kamar. This solution that Rabbi Tarfon is suggesting, is it lechatchila? Is he saying you're allowed to do this from the outset? And he's advising it? Oh, b'di'eved kamar. Or is he saying after the fact, if you did it, meaning is he permitting this? Is a mamzer allowed to marry a Canaanite slave? A Canaanite maidservant? Or is just, if he did, the child would be purified, would be free of the status of mamzer. So the Gemara is going to try to prove it, which way it is. So Tashma, come and listen. Amr lo Rabbi Tarfon. The Brisa says that the conversation with Rabbi Tarfon continued. They said to Rabbi Tarfon, Tihartas hazacharim. Your solution purifies the males. Velo tihartas hanakevos. But you didn't purify the females. You helped for the males. And the way Rashi understands this suggestion is, at least what we think they meant, is that helps for males. Because what's going to happen? A man who's a mamzer, how's he going to marry a maidser, a shifcha? what he could do is he could go somewhere where nobody knows him. He'll say, I'm an Eved, I'm a Canaanite slave, and he'll marry a Shifcha, nobody will stop him. So, but a mamzeres, a woman, it's not typical for her to travel like that, and to find solutions to secretly marry without, people are gonna protest, etc. So it seems that this solution would work for males, not for females. That's what they said to Rabbi Tarfon, and so the Gemara says, V'i amart lichatchila kamar. Now, if he meant that lichatchila, it's okay to go do this, mamzeres nami tinsim lavda. Let her go and do it. Meaning, it sounds like from this conversation that Rabbi Tarfon is not saying that this is permitted to just go ahead and do, because otherwise, why can't a woman do it too? The reservation for a woman to do it would be that it's not really okay, and you have to do it secretly, and it's not like typical that a woman would travel and pretend to be something she's not, and so that's why they said to Rabbi Tarfon, this helps for the males but not for the females. The males can do this undercover, but a woman wouldn't. But that sounds like he meant it b'diavad. If you did it, it would work. But he's not saying it's okay. If it was okay, then she could do it too. So the Gemara says, no, eved ein lo chayis. No, the reason what they were saying was you helped for the men but not for the women is because it wouldn't help for her to do it, because eved ein lo chayis. If she married an eved, it wouldn't have the yichus, the lineage wouldn't follow him. In other words, if a mamzer male goes and marries a female maidservant, or has a child with her, so then the child would follow the mother in that case. That's what we said. You follow if it's a non-Jewish woman, or it's a Canaanite maidservant, you follow the mother. The child will be an eved and not a mamzer. But if the mother's a mamzeres and the father's an eved, a slave, then the child will follow the mother and would also be a mamzer. So it just doesn't help. That's what they meant. It doesn't inform us whether Rabbi Tarfon was saying this l'chatchila b'diavad, you're allowed to, you're not allowed to. They were just saying you have a nice solution for men but not for women. Okay. Tashma. So come and listen, another attempted proof. Di'ush bezichne de Rabbi Simlai mamzer hava. Rabbi Simlai once stayed at a host, and the host was a mamzer. Ve'amar lei, and Rabbi Simlai said to this guy, I'akadamtach tartino livnach. Had I gotten here earlier, like in your life, I guess, I would have been able to purify your children. It sounds like it was too late. He already had children, they were mamzers, but he said if we had spoken, if only I'd known you earlier, we could have avoided this. Now what did he mean? Sounds like he meant I would have advised you with Rabbi Tarfon's solution. I would have advised you to marry a shifcha, a maidservant, and that would have solved the mamzer problem for your offspring. So, shapir. If this is something you're allowed to do l'chatchila, then it's good that it makes sense what he was saying. If only I met you first, I would have given you this advice of what to do. Eli amar di'eved, but if it's only okay b'di'eved, ma'aniu. So if Rabbi Tarfon's advice only works b'di'eved, so what did Rabbi Simlai mean? What would he have advised this guy? He can't tell him to do something you're only allowed to do b'di'eved after the fact. If you're not allowed to do it, you're not allowed to do it. He wouldn't have advised him. So what was he planning? What did he mean when he said, if I had gotten to you earlier, I would have been able to help you? So the Gemara says, Demintiv le eitza, because he could have given him an eitza, advice of the following, V'amar le, and told him, Zil genov, go and steal, Vizdavin be'eved ivri, and then sell yourself as an eved ivri. Because there's actually another solution, what the Gemara is really saying. Because even though it may be a problem, we're not sure, but we're discussing whether a mamzer is allowed to marry a shifcha a shifcha kananis or not, whether he's allowed to lichatchila from the outset intentionally marry a non-Jewish maidservant, but we know that an Eved Ivri is allowed to. A Jewish slave is allowed to. That's explicit in the Torah. And so, what he might have meant was, I would have advised you to become an Eved Ivri, become a Jewish slave, and then you'd be able to, do the solution for sure. Now, the Gemara could ask, what do you mean? He could advise him to steal? That doesn't make sense. You can't steal. So, but it doesn't ask. It has a different question. But that question it could have answered easily and said that, fine, there's other ways to become an Eved Ivri. You don't have to steal, even if if they don't have any money. Also, if they're in debt, they can also sell themselves as an Eved Ivri even without stealing. So he could have. The advice could have been, find a way to become an Eved Ivri, find a way to become a Jewish slave. A Jewish slave is allowed to marry a Shifcha Kananis. That's actually where we have the verse that says, Hayishav Yiladet Yiladena, the woman and her children will belong to the master. The children will be Avadim, they'll be slaves, and then, as long as they arrange in advance, the master could set them free, and then the children are purified. So, fine. So that's what we're suggesting. Maybe that was the solution that Rabbi Simlai had in mind. But ask the Gemara, Uvashani de Rabbi Simlai, Eved Ivri mihava? Was there such thing as an Eved Ivri in his times? Was there such thing as a Jewish slave in his times? V'ha'amar mar. But we were taught, Ein Eved Ivri noheg el bizman Yovel noheg. That Eved Ivri is only practiced when Yovel is practiced. Yovel, the Jubilee year, special halachos for the 50th year, including that slaves go free. So that the practice of Eved Ivri, of Jewish slaves, only, we learn from Psukim, only exists when Yovel is in practice. And Yovel is only in practice when the majority of the Jewish people and the Shvatim are in Eretz Yisrael. There's specific requirements. But once the 10 tribes were exiled and there was no longer Yovel being practiced. So it wasn't being practiced in his time. So Eved Ivri wasn't being practiced, so that couldn't have been the advice that he would have given him. So we must learn from here, Rabbi Tarfon lechatchila ka'amar, that Rabbi Tarfon did mean at lechatchila that you're allowed to do this. You're allowed to, when Rabbi Tarfon said, I have a solution to purify mamzerim, the mamzer can marry a maidservant even without becoming an Eved Ivri first. He must have meant it lechatchila, and that must have been the advice that Rabbi Simlai could have given that host had he gotten to him early enough. Shema Mina, we learn from here. And Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, that's the halacha. The halacha is like Rabbi Tarfon, and that it is permitted. Okay. Concluding the final Gemara of the chapter. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Hareze Eved Mamzer. So this is the end of the Bar Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer argued and said that no, if a mamzer marries a Canaanite maidservant, the child is not only an Eved, but is also a mamzer. Amar Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar said, not Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Lazar, an Amora, he said, my time de Rabbi Eliezer. What is the reasoning for the Tana, Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the child would be both an Eved, a slave, and a mamzer? The Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, lo. It says, when it talks about the prohibition of marrying mamzer, it says, lo yavo mamzer bikal Hashem, that a mamzer may not enter the congregation of Hashem, gam dor asiri, even the 10th generation, lo yavo lo bikal Hashem, should not come for him to the nation of Hashem. And that word lo, should not come for him, is extra. And what's it coming to teach me? Says the Gemara, Damakro lo, what it means is halech achar psulo. Go by his psul, his status, his diminished status, his mamzera status. So as long as the father, what it's telling me is lo yavalo, he cannot, even the 10th generation can't enter for him into the congregation, meaning as long as he's a mamzer, his offspring cannot enter, even if she's not a mamzeres. Even if the mother's not, even if the mother's maidservant, right, the child will be a mamzer. The Rabbanan. And what are the Rabbanan do about that? The Rabbanan, meaning Rabbi Tarfon, who says that the child's an eved and not a mamzer, in this case, of the mamzer that marries the maidservant. Hahu b'Yisrael shnasa mamzeres. That will be coming to teach me for a case where a Yisrael, a regular Jewish man, marries a mamzeres. They're not allowed to, but let's say they did. What is the status of the child? Salka daita chamina. I might have thought to say it says lemishpechosam leveisavosam. It says, when it talks about counting the Jewish people, it says according to their families, according to their fathers' houses, that the children, the families, follow the father's house. And so I might have said that if a Yisrael marries a mamzeres, if a regular Jewish man marries a mamzeres, what is the child? Follow the father, a regular Jew, not a mamzer. That's what I might have said. Asa lo and afke. The word lo comes and takes him out of that. Because lo, like we said before, it's a similar idea. Just here the mother's the mamzer. When it says lo yavo lo bikal Hashem, what it tells me is that if either parent is a mamzer, the child is a mamzer. We should not enter for him or her into the nation of Hashem. If either parent is a mamzer, the child is a mamzer. So that's what the Rabbanan would do with it. But that's specifically, they're limiting it to where both parents are Jewish. If in our case, where the father is, meaning in the Mishnah's case, where the father is a mamzer and the mother is a maidservant, that Rabbi Tarfon and the Rabbanan would maintain that the child would not be a mamzer, the child would just be an eved. The Rabbi Eliezer, what would Rabbi Eliezer say back to that? He would say, Lav af al gav de kasav mishpachosam uveisavosam. Isn't it true that even though it says, according to the families, according to the households, asalo and afke, in your case, where the father is a Yisrael and the mother is a mamzeres, we said that we follow because of the word lo takes him out. We don't follow the father, we follow the mother. She's a mamzer. The child's a mamzer. So hachanami, so in our case too, he says, afal gav dechsiv ha'ishav yiladet yel, even though we know in general, by a maidservant, the Torah says that the child follows the mother. If a Jewish man marries a maidservant, has a child with a maidservant, the child follows the mother and is a slave, is an eved. Even though that's true in general, says Rabbi Eliezer, but asalo afke. But here the word lo says, but mamzer is an exception. Mamzer, it says lo yavo lo b'kal Hashem, cannot enter for him, even if the father is. Even if the mother is a shifcha, is a maidservant, where usually the children go after her, but if the father is a mamzer, lo yavo lo, he can't have his offspring enter the congregation, and the child will be a mamzer, so he's both. He's both an eved and a mamzer. That's Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbanan say back, no. You can't, this is an exception to that, because there's no attachment anymore. Kovlad b'may shifcha kananis, kevlad b'may behema dami. A child in the womb of a shifcha kananis, of a Canaanite slave, is like a child in the womb of an animal. Meaning there's no relation to the father. The Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer, they're dancing around the same word lo, and saying that even when one parent is a mamzer, the child's a mamzer. That's what lo yavo lo teaches me. Cannot come for him, even though there's no her. Even if one parent is a mamzer, the child is still a mamzer. And Rabbi Eliezer is willing to apply that even where the mother's a shifcha, where the mother's a maidservant. But the Rabbanan say back, no. Like we learned that Canaanites, it says Shvulachan po ima chamor, stay here with the chamor, with the donkey, and we learned am hadom al chamor, that they're like chamor, meaning their offspring are, we applied that actually for Kiddushin not taking effect. Just like Kiddushin can't take effect on an animal, Kiddushin cannot take effect on a Canaanite. And to take another step, the child in the womb of the Canaanite is like the child in the womb of an animal, meaning that there's no relation to the father. There's no connection to the father. And so this will not, even though it says lo, but even though the father is a mamzer and it says lo, and even when there's only one parent mamzer, the child's still a mamzer, but that's only true if the father is connected to the vlad, is connected to the child. But in this case, the Rabbanan maintain that a child being carried in the womb of a Canaanite woman is disconnected from the father, and so would be an Eved, would not be a Mamzer, and actually once that child's set free, he can then, he completes his conversion, and he or she could marry a regular Jew and would not have the status of a Mamzer anymore. Hadran Allah HaOmer, we will return to you chapter HaOmer, Parak Shlishi, the third parak of Kiddushin, and Be'ezer Hashem, we will be moving on now to the final parak of Kiddushin, the fourth parak, Asar Yochsim. I look forward to learning with you.